Welcome to Tea Talks Unfiltered, a podcast where we drink tea, we talk, and they're both unfiltered. My name is Jake, and I will be your host. And on today's episode, we are going to be drinking a brand new pu'er tea, and we're going to be discussing traditional versus modern. All right, welcome everyone. I'm actually really excited to try this tea out because a Sichuan of mine, David Wei, Da Wei, sent it to me, and I haven't had a chance to try it out. So I thought I would sneak it into the episode and just have my taste testing today. But I hope you guys are joining me whenever you are, with the beverage of your choice. And I hope that you enjoyed today's conversation. Cheers. That's really nice. Very smooth, but it's got like a little aftertaste of some kind of wild element to it. It's really nice. Cool. Good tea for today's talk. I hope the talk can hold up to the quality of the tea as well. So, all right, let's get started. Today I want to talk about traditional and modern. I think that these words carry a lot of weight. They carry a lot of connotation also attached to them, especially when we start talking about martial arts. And so you'll notice these first few episodes, I'm really just going into vocabulary, terminology. What does this mean? What are the elements of that? But I think that that's a really important approach because we need to have these distinct understandings, these distinct definitions of each category so that we know we're on the same page. There's no confusion. I think that nowadays, especially with terms like this, because the definition kind of naturally evolves over time, to talk about specifically what's at hand in society, I think that a lot of times there's a lot of miscommunication and confusion and misassociation attached to a lot of these terms. So I think it is important to kind of go back to the basics and explain what each of these words mean. So when we start talking about traditional martial arts and we're talking about this system of training, or we start talking about Taoism, we understand the context that we're relating it to. I think that that's really essential. So you'll notice we're going through a lot of vocabulary, but stick with me. I hope that each one of these words kind of opens up your perception a little bit more, gets you on the same page with what I'm talking about, but also I think with what the natural progression of these systems of thought are. And the philosophy stems from that. The practice stems from that. Our belief creates our existence. It creates our worldview. And so it's really important to kind of have that definition be framed correctly. Okay. So today we're going to be talking about that. I want to talk about the different terms that we use, traditional and modern, but I think that we have to go back a little bit farther and talk about the terminology for Kungfu, Gongfu, Wushu, traditional, modern, culture, sport, competition, health. We need to talk about some of these elements, how they're related, and how in today's world we've decided that they conflict with each other, when in actuality I think that they complement and benefit each other more so. So that's kind of the summary of what we're going to talk about today. A little bit of history lessons, a little bit of language lessons, and some kind of analysis of that. And so I hope that opens up some ideas for you guys. So let's get started. All right. First thing, we do need to go way back, and we do need to start off and kick the talk off with a small history lesson. So we're going to start with the two easiest terminologies to distinguish from one another. Okay. And that will be the term Kungfu and the term Gongfu. Okay. These get used interchangeably quite a lot, and there is a fair reason for that. But there is some definition, some connotation that each one holds that I think that as we uncover, you might find that you have a preference, or it might offer more clarity to what kind of conversation you're having when you know these kind of associations. Okay. So there is a reason why each of these terms can be interchangeable. And the reason is because Chinese has been phonetically spelled out by two different systems historically. There's probably more, I imagine, but two main popular systems. The first one, the prior one actually, is the Wade's Giles system. Okay. Now, today, we use pinyin Okay, and these are both different systems where Chinese gets spelled phonetically for a Western audience, okay, for an English audience, because all the characters, the writing is not phonetic for the most part. Everything is done by memory, by rote, and there isn't like a character you can point to and you can understand it without understanding kind of the different relationships that each one of those sub-characters has inside it. Sometimes there's a phonetic sound included, but not always. And so Pinyin and Wade-Giles systems were invented to put sounds and offer the alphabet, the 26-letter alphabet that we carry in English and other languages, over into Chinese so we can kind of visualize it a little bit better for understanding. So Wade-Giles is the first one. And Wade-Giles has an approach that includes a more comprehensive list of Chinese dialects. If you're familiar with any Chinese culture and history, you're probably very aware of that. There are a vast number of different dialects in China currently and historically. There are dialects for towns and villages and different parts of China. And the one thing that connects them all together is the written language. So the written language is uniform. Okay, just kind of summarize a bunch of history there really quickly. But to say that the written language is uniform and kind of standardized, whereas the spoken language is very much tied up in dialect, and there are variations throughout China. Today, there is a more solid foundation for Mandarin speakers. There's still Cantonese in some places, but the vast majority of China has kind of moved over to speaking Mandarin or Putonghua. And so that is a system that is better associated with Pinyin. It's more standard. It doesn't deviate as much as the old dialects would. Because of this shift, Wade-Giles system is a better system for kind of the academia because it includes all these other dialects. The way the spelling, the phonetic spelling is done, it's more inclusive to those different dialects. So this is where you'll get spellings like Tai Chi, Tren, with a C-H-U-A-N at the end. So you get that Tai Chi, T-A-I-C-H-I, right? As opposed to in Pinyin, you'll get Tai Ji, which is T-A-I-J-I, okay? And so there's a lot of things like that. You know, you have Taiji, you have Taoism with a T, or Taoism with a D, being T is Wade-Giles and D is Pinyin. You have Lao Tzu, so you have that TZU. TZU is Wade-Giles and ZI is Pinyin. And so you got Lao Tzu or Lao Tzu. And so I think that sometimes that interpretation also kind of gets in people's minds, and you know, it can be understood even differently in English. I know when I first came, I think I mentioned this when I first came to Wudang, I referred to Qigong as Qigong, just because in English every Q there's always a U sound after. And so I saw the spelling, I just imagined the letter U being in there and pronounced Qigong as Qigong, which is very embarrassing, but I have to relive that over and over. So there is kind of like some confusion on the systems. Okay, so just a brief history lesson to explain that. You know, terms like Taoism, Tai Chi and Tai Ji, Lao Tzu, Zhuangzi, and Lao Tzu and Chuangzi. You know, you have those kind of. I'm overemphasizing the Wade-Giles system just so you can hear the difference. But those different spellings sometimes are just a brief confusion on the very front of the conversation, because you might see these terms used interchangeably, or you might think that they're referencing different things, when in fact they're not. They're just the evolution of the language that we use to phonetically write down Chinese has changed. And so today, predominantly we're using Pinyin. So some of those older phrases are not antiquated, but you know, they've been updated to some degree. And sometimes that's confusing because you'll read someone talking about Tai Chi and then everyone else is referring to it as Tai Ji. And, you know, you're not sure if there's a distinction, and it really is just the language. Okay, so with our two first terminologies, Kungfu and Gongfu, we can really just understand that as this distinction between phonetic spellings and how Kungfu precedes, in the Western world at least, the term Gongfu. Okay. Gongfu is, the Gongfu. This spelling is much more commonly used in today's world, especially because Mandarin is the widely spoken language now in China. And that Kung Fu has actually been around for so long that I think that in my own experience, especially, it's taken on a new life. It's taken on a new kind of connotation and meaning, especially to the Western world. Okay, so let's dig into that, because we can understand it as just a spelling differentiation between phonetic kind of systems, right? But because of the time, because of the influence of society and trending and this kind of stuff, those definitions do deviate from their original source material, right? And so while Kung Fu is a derivative of Gongfu, they are the same root, essentially. Kung Fu has, in the West, taken on this life of a more encompassing term than it truly is. Okay, so an example. When I went home, after spending a few years in Wudang, Kung Fu, where I'm from, is to the general public is just a very broad term that it just means all sorts of martial arts practices, and it doesn't always just kind of assimilate just to one system. It just kind of, this kind of martial arts in general in Asia, if it's not like a Western system, if it's an Asian system in general, it just becomes Kung Fu. So that kind of umbrellas a lot of systems. I've heard people refer to it as like karate, taekwondo, Chinese martial arts, Wing Chun. I've heard them kind of just refer to this as Kung Fu. So that term has kind of become a general idea of just Eastern martial arts practices, right? Which is definitely a kind of simplifying of the term, right? But the term Kung Fu or Gongfu is a very simple term at its base, right? It doesn't necessarily specifically even apply to martial arts. The term Kung Fu, the term Gongfu, it literally translates to just like a skill, this kind of achievement of practice, of your method of attaining skill, if you will. And so it doesn't really associate directly with fighting techniques, sparring techniques, forms, physical practice in really any way outside of that kind of physical, or you can say the achievement, right? But outside of that, there's not really a strong indicator that this refers to Chinese martial arts right now at this point. It really just refers to any kind of skill. So you'll hear this talked about more recently in classic like mainstream examples where they talk about how Kung Fu can be in a carpenter, an artist can have Kung Fu, a teacher can have Kung Fu, and that is kind of like the oversimplified, this is the idea, right? That Kung Fu is not an ability, but a talent that's been achieved over hard work, Kung Fu equals, practice plus time and dedication, this kind of thing. So it really is a general term in its essence, but it's begun to specifically be applied to martial arts. So, when Neo wakes up in the Matrix and says, "I know Kung Fu," he's not talking about, building a table. He's not talking about drawing a picture. He's not talking about having this like great ability because of the hard work he's put in. No, he's literally talking about, I know Kung Fu, I can kick and punch you in the face. And, he's saying, I know all these Asian martial arts now. And so there is this like pop culture idea of Kung Fu that's specifically now applied to martial arts. Okay. And I think it's a more general term as well. Just Eastern arts in general. People don't normally subcategorize things like karate, taekwondo, Chinese martial arts. They don't really subcategorize them at the level of saying Kung Fu. It just kind of means all those practices, right? And so I think that that's kind of a very big simplification. but it is kind of like the relevant conversation in today's world. So then we have a third terminology, Wushu, W-U-S-H-U, by the Pinyin system. Okay. Now this actually is definitely more specific towards martial arts. The character for Wu literally translates to like martial, and Shu means art, or this kind of creation. And so you really literally have martial art. That's just the definition directly through. And now you have something that's definitely directed towards these physical practices. That's definitely directed towards this fighting, this sparring, these kinds of activities, right? But there is also this element of art. There's this element of character building, of kind of you can carry through that idea of Gongfu in this art, right? You can carry forward that kind of skill achieved over practice and time in your art practice, right? Because you're applying that to your physical practice. So you have this kind of balance in the term Wushu, martial arts. Okay, so now we find a term that's like specifically directed towards what we're doing and these different practices. Now, Wushu has a little bit of its own history. It has a little bit of its own breakdown that I think is really important. The character for Wu is actually made up of two pieces. And one piece of that is stop, like to stop, the verb to stop. And the second part is ge, and it kind of translates to a lance, like a spear, or I think I saw in some like slang terms as like a dagger axe, just a weapon of some sort, right? And so you have this kind of stop and weapon. And so, okay, now we get into a really, really big conversation about what this distinction means. And, I think there's this kind of, there's this element of art that's applied to this definition. So, for example, we have to stop and we have weapons. So you think the martial art practice is to stop using weapons, to stop other people using weapons. So maybe it becomes a kind of a protection thing. But maybe it also becomes, if you apply that art to it, it also becomes something that says, this is the martial art practice. The goal is to have these combat arts in order to stop using the combat arts. And so you have this kind of paradox in the name itself, I think, where it's saying, we're trying to accomplish this feat. We're trying to accomplish this skill so that way we don't need to use it. And that sounds kind of counterintuitive and kind of redundant in some ways. But I think it's very true that there's this idea that, you want to have the ability, the capability, but you don't necessarily want to utilize it, right? That's kind of like your last option. We talk about this in the Tao Te Ching, talk about this in a lot of, like even the art of war, where like, violence is always the last resort. And then there's like some Western quote that's coming to mind that's, like true violence is something that, is capable but never done. I can't remember exactly how that's worded. But there is this kind of idea, I think, integrated into that character of to stop fighting, And this term is maybe a little bit more traditional. It has a bigger history inside China. I have some facts here pulled up. And the term martial arts goes way back specifically to this term called Wu Yi, which is in the Song period circa 960. And that's when the term Bingji Chao, which means like the weapon, military fighting techniques, moved over to Wu Yi, which means like martial. And this is kind of, Yi is another term for art. So you have this kind of base term already established, this kind of martial art. So you have a system, right? And then later on, actually relatively recently, in the 1900s, it moved over to Guoshu, which means country arts. So China as a government was kind of trying to identify their martial arts practices as something, as part of their heritage. So it became Guoshu. But very quickly, that term kind of rolled back into Wushu. And so you carried over that old martial character from Wu Yi way back in the day, and combined it with the Shu of the national art, and now it became military art. Sometimes you'll hear like Zhongguo Wushu, you'll hear Chinese martial art, and that kind of just identifies it and specifies specifically what we're talking about. And so that term has kind of had its own evolution to get where it is now. And there is, of course, a kind of parallel evolution of that in society, and kind of the interpretation of that. Okay, so while I think that Wushu is probably the most clear term to talk about the practice that we use, it's not typically referred to when you're talking about traditional martial arts. People will normally use the general kind of layman term of Kungfu, or if they're being really precise, Gongfu, right? But the more appropriate term, Wushu, isn't really often used because of the connotation that that's now attached to. Okay, Wushu is now attached to more contemporary physical competition, right? And so it's kind of moved even more into that art aspect and this competitive based kind of arena. Okay, and specifically that's what China kind of stabilized the term to be. They wanted it to be something that identified their standardized kind of physical training and conditioning. And so very quickly that term Wushu evolved into what we refer to now as that contemporary acrobatic kind of Chinese style martial art of Wushu. Okay, so even then, like, this terminology really carries more weight in kind of the traditional sense, but now it's kind of moved over, and now it's talking more specifically about that competitive acrobatic type style. And so just to clarify that real quick, we have those contemporary usages of Kungfu, Gongfu, and Wushu. Kungfu is that just general term. Gongfu, we're going to probably apply that more to a kind of martial arts practice, traditional based school. And so that's what maybe the people within the circle of training martial arts will refer to it as Gongfu. And Kungfu is from the outside, kind of encompassing everything. And Wushu, while we refer to that as the system, the forms, the kind of routines and training regimens that we create, now it's kind of been pushed more into that competitive arena, kind of what is more standardized across the board, has a lot more to do with kind of that modern approach now. Especially like if you're looking at things like they want to have Wushu in the Olympics, and they want to do this kind of sport competition across the world. Now you're talking more about Wushu. You're talking more about this kind of more performative almost and presentative of the system, and maybe a little bit of a less emphasis on the application, the fighting application of it. It's more about conditioning the body to be able to achieve these great feats. Okay, so Wushu is also kind of taken on a different light in the modern world. So now we get to traditional and modern, talking about how that interplay has kind of grown from history to its modern day usage. Now we're starting to see that dynamic of how things evolve. And there is a distinction there. And I think that distinction goes deeper than just the basic vocabulary. There are ways to distinguish a traditional martial art from a modern one. Okay, so the most widely understood maybe system of thought between those two is, if you refer to tradition, you're probably also referring to Kung Fu in some way, or Kung Fu, right? You're referring to one of those systems of school in China that is based on these kind of forms and systems of training through traditional weapons, through a relationship to your master. So you have a shifu, and there's kind of this basic training conditioning regimen that's more standardized within that system, versus what we would call modern, which, if you're thinking modern, the first thing that probably comes to your mind is something like MMA, UFC, boxing, kick. You're thinking of something that is based in competition, something that's probably a specific style. So it identifies as Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu or Taekwondo or something like this. You're thinking of a specific system that has used definitely a scientific approach to kind of manifest the most optimum version of itself, right? But if you hear tradition and you hear modern, I think the first distinguishing mark that you make in your mind is something that has to do with maybe health, relationship, philosophy, and something that has to do with competition and this physical efficacy, right? That is an oversimplification, but we'll get into that. That's just kind of where we want to start with, because that's where we have the most common ground, right? So I think that this is something that we can't really force a comparison on right from the beginning, because we're ignoring or minimizing each of those practices to a single aspect, right? If we start to compare Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, for example, with Tai Chi Chuan, we're really never going to agree, because each group is going to claim that the other is useless. There is this kind of just conversation that's already online everywhere, where one claims that the other ignores the values that it needs. So Tai Chi practitioners will talk about the loss and the lack of structure and respect and culture and character building that MMA offers, when it does offer that on some level. And MMA will talk about how the traditional schools are losing and lacking in their efficacy and their pressure testing and their real world experience. And that's a valid claim, right? In some respects. But there are ways that pressure testing is done that doesn't necessarily happen in an arena or in a street fight. And so I think that that's a whole different conversation. I think that what we have to do first is we have to agree on the terminology that we've established. And we kind of understand that there is a distinction between what we would deem traditional and what we would deem modern, right? So a traditional school implies some kind of cultural background, right? It implies this kind of ancestral hierarchy where there's something being passed down, there's some learning, there's some experience that's being shared, and these generations are following a specific standard, right? So there's kind of like an honor system of those that came before. And so that's really like kind of maybe the foundation block of a traditional system. That's really essential to the whole practice, right? When you hear modern, you hear, these kind of more scientific approaches, you're really implying this sense of development and progression. You're implying that this system follows the current trend of society, the conversation at hand, what's being used, what's being found effective, and what's being kind of peeled away from those layers as not necessary anymore, right? And so you have this kind of maybe like a purifying practice that's happening, hopefully, right? But it's always in a certain context. And I don't think that this belittles either practice. I think that the opposite is actually really true. Because while the modern systems, for example, they are always looking to revolutionize, and they're closely tied with their environment. They're very closely tied with society and like I said, what's at hand, what's being proven effective. And they're finding that most appropriate tool for each situation. That's a really honorable value. That's a really great skill to have, and it really shows that they're not just inheriting their practice, but they're also going out and challenging it, and they're testing out their own theories. And so that's a really, really valuable thing. Where traditional systems, they have that kind of belief structure, they have that faith in the system, excuse me, that carries over into the way they conduct themselves outside of class. And so the physical practice, in some ways, I think evolves past what's happening in class. And it carries over into your relationships and into the way that you kind of exist in society and within your family on a small scale, within your city and your world on the larger scale. So I think that there's a really important value there that's allowing you to apply what you learn in class to different levels. It's not just doing this skill to achieve the highest point or the highest grade or to win the match. It's more about cultivating this longer sense of balance and character building and morality. Again, you can see already where both of these share common ground. And there are aspects that a traditional system also does pressure test, and it also does build some kind of efficacy, and it knows that the standards that it practices at are effective, right? And you know that a modern system, as it evolves and as people get deep into the practice, they also have this sense of respect and some kind of standard, and there is a tradition that grows from that. Again, they are based in different beginning points, but they reach similar conclusions, I think, if they're practiced effectively. So then one little idea to kind of just distinguish what we're normally talking about when we talk about these practices. We can say a traditional and a modern school, what their approach is going to significantly include or be focused upon. Okay, so a traditional school is going to be more focused on something like culture, right? You're going to be more focused on this tradition. Modern school, more focused on sport, more focused on that fitness and the efficacy, right? Traditional, again, we're talking about health. We're talking about the longevity of the practice and the person practicing it, right? The practitioner. Modern, we're talking about that efficacy and the competition. We're talking about the success rate on a short scale of that practitioner. Traditional, again, we carry that tradition right in the word, like that is the main starting point of the practice, and just kind of preserving that culture, passing it down, understanding it to its completion. A modern school, the focus is going to be on progression. It's going to be on that individual driving forward and being able to effectively use the most valuable tools at hand. Traditional school, based on community, based on those connections to your relationships. It's based on not just when you join a school, you're not just learning the practice. You're also becoming a part of that group. You're also becoming a part of how you conduct yourself. And that conduct is directly related to your practice. Okay? Just a focus. And while the modern side is going to be less focused on the community in some ways and more focused on that progression of the individual, that scientific immersion into your practice to pick out and perform at an extreme level, right? So it has that kind of isolated type approach where we're really treating each individual as an individual and trying to bring you as far as possible, right? Whereas that traditional is kind of, we're bringing the whole community with us. As we build face for one person, we're building that connection, that reputation of the entire practice, right? Traditional, the last kind of standard I would say distinguishes it is there is an emphasis on cultivation. There is an emphasis on this kind of tending and constant kind of finding the path of least resistance. Finding that balancing point where you can move through a situation effortlessly because you've practiced the physical movement, but you've also tuned that and internalized that into the way you act, the way that you kind of exist. So there's that cultivation of your path, right? That includes physical practice, but I think goes farther and definitely more essentially focused on that emotional well-being and balance and conflict. Modern, again, while we share some of those ideas, the main purpose is definitely going to be on goal setting. It's going to be on seeing a record, and smashing through it, or setting a goal and moving past it and setting another goal. And there's this drive and motivation that supersedes sometimes those standards at a fault. It's going to It's going to have a career path, and there is going to be a career length. That traditional practice is something that's supposed to be higher than the self. It's something that you inherit and something that you pass forward and to the next generation. You don't really set your goals to pass them on to the next generation more than, or rather than give your goals to the next generation at a modern school to see if they can break it. It becomes a test and not a shared achievement. Excuse me. So you can see there are some kind of distinctions between a traditional and a modern system, especially on the surface. Right now, that's kind of what we're focused on, just what we imply when we use those terms. I think that kind of clarifies, where we are and how there's conflict that evolves from that distinguish aspect, that contrast. Because as soon as we say that, we start understanding that, well, no, tradition systems also have this goal setting practice. They also have this progression of the individual. But it because it's not the foundation of the general practice, it's not the kind of zoomed out approach. Because of that, the practice itself changes. There are small adjustments that happen along the way that kind of build you a certain type of environment, build you a certain type of system, and those practices also change with time. When you have an emphasis on culture and preservation and your emphasis on character building the group, there's definitely going to be an approach in your training that's focused on the practices and what you can achieve and kind of based on what those before you have achieved. And it's very easy for a traditional system to sidestep the question of efficacy, especially when society as a whole, the quality of life, everything improves. And so now that element of to stop fighting actually becomes achievable. And so the practice very easily shifts into, instead of a application as like, we're doing these combative techniques for the military to train to be able to condition themselves to overcome enemies. Now we can actually utilize that goal of the original term to stop fighting. We can actually understand these practices, and now we're only carrying on that understanding. We're carrying on that comprehension, and it becomes more of a preservation. It becomes more of this peacetime character building. I think that's maybe not doing justice to the entire conversation, but I think it's an easy kind of feature to be able to understand about a traditional system and how the use of it is not focused solely in the efficacy. It's also focused on these relationships and the way one conducts oneself, right? But at the same time, we're always holding on to those foundational skills. And so I think that's where the modern comes from, is now we have that foundation and we're able to build from that. We're able to isolate pieces of it and navigate a world where now the rules have changed and we can apply the best tool to that situation, because this is where the biggest, the biggest kind of drawback of both systems will come up. Is the thing that's wrong with these systems is, what are the things that they overlook? What are the practices that the arenas that they don't have any value in? And I think when you start to apply a traditional system to a modern arena, specifically, like literally an arena, then you lose a lot of the value of that traditional system, because it was never meant to be applied in a sports system. It wasn't necessarily meant to be applied in a competition system. It was meant as something to cultivate and condition to a point that it's useful, but also to a point that when it's left alone, there's other benefits that come from it that we can also focus on. The goal setting of a modern martial art, without it, there is still value, of course. There is still these same traditional kind of benefits included within that training, of course. But there is this kind of focal point of the standard you set, the barriers you break, the goals that you realize. right? And that deems what's the best at the time. And what is best at the time very quickly becomes the trending kind of practice, right? And that's based on the arena. That's based on the environment that you're practicing in. So the rules change and the system changes and it evolves. And that's really, really great for the practice and for that kind of progression. But it's sometimes, because that evolution is very short-lived and it moves on to the next thing and the next thing, I think that there are people involved in each system who probably are sad to see their system only be used to a certain level. You know, there are probably great Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu practitioners who they have this idea. I've listened to interviews of them talking about these traditional values and the system and the structure and the time, the discipline and the commitment, and what that means to them as, you know, lineage holders, or what it means to them as teachers, masters, instructors of some sense. And they understand this in the same kind of light that we understand a traditional practice. But I think simultaneously there's this idea that they also know that there's something missing from the average practitioner, because the system has only become a tool. It's become a process to practice, to understand this piece, get that skill, and then move on to something else to complement and to build your progression so that you can hit this goal that you set for yourself. In that window, in that period of time, there's a larger chance of risk, of injuring oneself. There's a chance of having a short career life and maybe not having the commitment to a specific style to really get deep into that practice, to really get deep into the I would say, especially during a time like now when quality of life isn't such improved, and, you know, where the average person is at a state of peace, I would say, we might risk the potential of missing out on those bigger cultivating aspects of the practice, where we're going to change character or challenge perspective and worldview. You know, a tool can be discarded. A tool can be used in the moment and laid down when it's not used. But a traditional practice is more about nourishment. It's about getting the tool that enriches you and you carry with you. It's not something that you utilize for the moment and put aside. So I think there's a conversation there where we can talk about what is wrong with these systems. You know, one risks losing those benefits of a long-term dedication and only having a short career life potentially, depending on how involved you are with the competition side of it. And one can be a closed loop. You know, the traditional system, because it doesn't demand a pressure testing, it doesn't demand this kind of real-time conversation with the modern society. Because it is a closed loop, your belief can sometimes lead to blind following, because everything that you need is encompassed in the system. And so sometimes you don't see the value of learning outside of that system, because people may, correctly or falsely, I think, believe that their whole system is kind of all-encompassing. And so this is where you get that false belief, you know, that kind of understanding that everything is here included. And I think that can be really detrimental to your practice and to your kind of life as well. You know, there is kind of a risk in that as well. So I think that now in today's world, we have to understand that tradition is tied to preservation. You know, we're trying to find that stability and that longevity in the modern world, you know, and that modern side is tied to competition. You know, we're trying to create the best thing possible, the best result. Both have their place. I think it still takes this combination and cooperation between the two, because they each have value. And you can't remove them from their context, right? We can't say this traditional system has no room in the arena, okay? Or the arena, this sport training kind of isolated approach has no meaning for a traditional school. I think that that's overlooking the value that each one has to offer. And this isn't to say that a traditional school should start competing and fighting every day, and a modern kind of approach to training shouldn't, start bowing to everybody and having this, kind of cultural upbringing, etiquette. But I think that there is value in experiencing that on both sides, and whether that's pressure testing your training in a traditional school with performances, or challenging ideas, or trying out different approaches to your practice. It doesn't necessarily have to be putting on gloves and entering a boxing ring to train your practice outside of its parameters. It doesn't necessarily mean that. That could be a good experience for you to kind of get deeper into your practice and kind of understand what is a health benefit and what is useful, and where those overlap. Because I think that nowadays, if we look at a traditional system like what I practice, for example, I also do not really believe that there's a standard that I can get to where I'm going to use tiger fist in a fight, or dragon fist, or push hands. I think that a lot of these things are the building blocks of how we condition and how we understand movement. And now we have to build from that, isolate pieces of it in order to be effective. But I also think that's because the arena has shifted over to a different parameter, right? And so now we have a specific guideline, we have an approach. And so of course the all-encompassing idea of a traditional art is not going to fit in that box. And in order to have this system be useful, we're going to have to shape it down and hone specific qualities down and purify them to approach what is the context of a modern system. And so there is an evolution that has to happen. But likewise, if you're in a modern school, there has to be some kind of longevity to the practice. There has to be something to complement the sport activity, the kind of high impact, high intensity, potentially short-lived career. There has to be something to balance that, because without it, you're really just setting a goal, and it's win or lose, but at the end, it's still going to be over, right? And so there has to be something behind that to help you kind of continue your own practice in whatever form that may be. So we should have the tradition to preserve that etiquette and to grow in that healthy environment. But we should be able to use those modern approaches to clarify and to enrich the practices, and not to take anything away. Because we can't force that comparison, right? This is the kind of idea of, the metaphor I heard recently was, we have this paradox of a belief where we can say simultaneously that, kids have it so easy today, and, back in my day, it was so tough, and we walked uphill to school both ways. And, nowadays it's just so simple, and kids are so lazy, or blah, blah, blah. But at the same time, the same parents also believe and also practice that they want to give the best world possible without all that hardship to their children. And that's an interesting thing, because separately we can understand that. We can understand, yeah, kids are lazy, and I do want the best for them. I don't want them to work hard. But then when we understand those together, we can see that there's a conflict there. But the conflict is only created in that moment, because we do hold these paradoxical beliefs all the time. We understand intuitively that a modern system of fighting, for example, is really useful. But we should also maintain the understanding that these traditional practices are underlying that usefulness. They are kind of the backbone of what that was built off of. And so while we don't want you to have to suffer, we want you to be better, but we also don't want you to be lazy. So there is this kind of balance that needs to be struck between the two, where everything is done productively and we see improvement. We see each system enhancing the other. And it's not just a career or our livelihood, but it also contributes to that ongoing conversation. It contributes to society in a general way, to where we can bring and grow and develop together. But it also improves the individual to where it doesn't ignore you based on a statistic. It doesn't ignore you based on the general uptick is good. It also says that this system is best for you in this way. And if it's not, if there is something better, then we should be able to seek that out. So I think in today's world, we have a really great opportunity for that. We have communication that's instantaneous. We have options available for us to practice different routines and to develop different skills. So I think it's even more important in today's world that we understand this distinction of traditional and modern and how we interact with both. Because if we only take this modern approach and we try to pick the best quality from everything, we'll only dip our toes in each system. We'll only half experience everything. And we won't enrich ourselves with that dedication and that commitment and that discipline that something traditional, in one sense, would offer. That kind of time and developing Gongfu over time and practice and hard work. That experience alone is a small, closed loop of pressure testing. We can pressure test in 5 minutes and 3 rounds, but we can also pressure test over years and seasons of our life. And so I think that efficacy sometimes isn't seen as directly because it's part of a larger picture. It's not something that we can quantify as easily. I think that the modern approach should be more how we diagnose and how we understand and what we choose to focus more towards. But I think we should carry that traditional value along with it so that we can have a structure to fall back on, so we can have an etiquette to guide us, and so we can have that community of connected motivation and not just individual progression. There has to be room for both. So as we move forward and as we go through these tea talks, and you're noticing that again, that emphasis in vocabulary and just how we perceive things. And I like to start the conversation there. I like to really dig deep into these definitions because I do believe that names are very important. The way we absorb information and the way we project our existence into our relationships, whether that's with our family, our career, our practice, our society, our political view, however we engage, that is a direct reflection of kind of what we're going to perceive. We become products of our environment. And so we should create an environment where we can excel in the long term just as well as the short term. It shouldn't be something we sacrifice. These words are really important. I think that these words, these thoughts, these kinds of perceptions, they carry a weight that our actions gravitate to and build off of. We have that foundation that we're going to revolve around. So in Taoism, we speak a lot about cultivation. We speak a lot about this idea of growth. This is really a key word. It really brings that idea to your mind. Cultivation. You're not just manifesting something, you're tending to it. And in this way, we are gardeners. We should view ourselves like that. We are tending the garden and growing our character, growing our physical efficacy and our well-being. And all those things, all those results, we are going to judge based on the harvest, based on the fruit of our labor. We are going to compare that to the situation at hand. That's kind of the ideal, the modern ideal. That is the standard set at that time. We have to know where we are as we harvest our practice. There is that comparison that happens instantaneously, and we can't really do away with that, because we do need to know our standing point. We do need to be able to compare season to season that growth, that improvement, and understand how we can change. But I think that when we try to resolve those problems and we try to find that path forward, we must tend to the roots. We must use those guiding principles of tradition. We must be able to understand that comparison, not just to your neighbor, not just to the other person and that individual, because now we're comparing the parameters set by one person to one person, which is never going to be equal. We have a certain constitution, we have a certain kind of ability and talent and luck and skill, and we can drive forward and motivate ourselves to increase that yield, so to say. But at some point there is going to be a distinguishing factor. And so if we can still tend to those roots and give ourselves the best opportunity for growth, that is going to be the most useful. If we understand that crops are not growing on this plot of land, we can't just keep harvesting and keep planting and sowing in the same place. We need to understand that maybe that place is used and we need to change to this location and practice this system and develop these skills so that we can have growth once again. But just because we move from one arena to the next, smaller or larger, we cannot just throw away what we've learned. Those traditions still have educational value. They still have development that is possible because of them. The crop still grows the same over here. We're just changing the characteristics and maybe the quantities of attention, sunlight, water. We're adding and altering to get a better improvement. But that improvement should still be compared to the field at whole. It should be compared to enriching the whole society. It's not just about one plant growing the most amount of fruit. We have to have this balance. We have to have this context so that they can be understood and used to enrich ourselves and each other. And so tradition and modern are really two sides of the same coin. You can't really have one without the other. And trying to compare left to right is just going to turn you around in circles. So I hope that with that idea, you can see how we're always moving towards a point of balance. And that, once again, is definitely the source of these tea talks and what I'm trying to communicate through this camera or this speaker, this headphone, however you're tuning in. That is really the emphasis of all of these episodes, all of these talks that we're going to be coordinated around this theme. So I hope that we can find this balance between traditional and modern and understand how they complement each other. So with that, here's to finding balance. One cup of tea at a time. Thank you for tuning into today's episode Subscribe and join me every Tuesday for new episode releases, also available wherever you get your podcasts. Support the Ways of Wudang through Patreon and get access to resources, classes, and more. Keep the conversation going with hashtag #TTalkUnfiltered or connect with me directly by joining the Ways of Wudang on Discord. Links are in the description. I'll talk with you next time for another cup of tea.